In this essay, I'm going to do a deep analysis of a video showing an example of police brutality. Then I will use that to talk about what I feel is one of the main problems with law enforcement, especially in the United States. Before we get too far into this video, I'd like to get a few things out of the way. First of all, content warning, this is a video about police violence and racism. I'm going to be talking about people being beaten or killed by law enforcement, a disproportionate number of whom were people of color. But I will not be showing any footage of those murders or any footage of any violent crime. The main video we'll be discussing is one where thankfully no one was injured. I could show footage of people being killed, but I had to watch a ton of snuff films to write this essay, and I don't feel like rewatching them multiple times during editing. Also, it feels vaguely disrespectful to use footage of someone dying or being brutalized to make a video essay. I don't know, the idea just puts a bad taste in my mouth. Second, it must be noted that this video is inherently going to be shaped by my own biases. I am very, very white. I have never had a single negative interaction with a police officer, but I don't want to be that guy who hears a black person in, let's say Los Angeles for example, say they were a victim of police racism, and then go, but the police aren't bad. How could there be problems with police being racist and violent in dense urban centers when me, a white person living in rural Iowa, have not experienced racism from the police in cities I've never visited? I don't want to be that guy. This essay is largely inspired by interviews I've read and conversations I've had with people online about their experiences with the police, aided with as much statistical data as I could find. Third, I would like to make something clear. I will not be demonizing the police in this video. I'm not going to do that. Police aren't monsters, they're people. And a lot of them are really, really bad people, and a lot of them are bad because of systemic problems in American policing, but me pointing out those problems is not demonization. It feels that way to some people because a lot of Americans have a downright religious worship of law enforcement, something I lack. I don't think being a cop inherently makes you a hero or even a good person. Throughout this essay, I will treat cops as people. I believe that an action carried out by a cop is only moral if it would also be moral for an ordinary person to do so. I don't have a problem with the police, killing an armed murderer to protect someone, not because the police are special, but because I think it is fine for anyone, regardless of profession, to do so in that situation. And the inverse is also true. If an act is immoral for an ordinary person to do, then it is equally immoral for a cop to do so. Like if you shot someone in the head for throwing an aluminum can at you, you would go to jail because of fucking course you would. Theft, assault, and murder don't suddenly become fine just because the perpetrator is wearing a badge. Finally, this video will, by its very nature, be limited in scope. There are a lot of interesting arguments out there about whether police, even if they do their jobs to the letter and never engage in brutality, are good for society. And honestly, parts of these arguments are convincing. The job of police to enforce the law means that if the law is evil, then it is the job of the police to be evil. For example, for a big part of this country's history, the main job of cops was to beat the shit out of black people who drank from the wrong water fountain. And, with our country quickly descending into fascism, having armies of men with guns whose job it is to enforce the will of the state is kinda worrying, especially with the concerning links between cops and white supremacist terrorist organizations. But this conversation is beyond the scope of this essay. In the past, I have made the mistake of trying to make essays that are about everything I wanted to say on a topic, and as a result, those essays were muddled and way too fucking long. I want this video to be a concise examination of a specific problem. I wrote that sentence a month ago when I first started work on this essay, hoping this video would be like 20 minutes long, and then I wrote 8,000 words anyway, so fuck it, this one's gonna be long. During this video, I will operate under the commonly held assumption that it is good to have men whose job it is to arrest those who commit crimes. Because, as I shall explain, even in a world where the idea of police is good, the police often aren't. Now then, let's talk about crime. Do you remember what 2020 was like? It felt like the world was ending. We were all hiding from the pandemic, the economy was collapsing, and then the Minneapolis PD lynched a man to death. And let's be clear, this was a lynching by any definition of the word. A lynching is when a person is executed by an angry group of people without trial, traditionally performed via strangulation, generally for racist reasons. That is what happened to George Floyd. Both the Floyd family and the family of Emmett Goddamn Till have called the incident a lynching, and I will continue to call that incident what it was throughout this video. This brutal murder set off a series of massive protests against police violence. An estimated 15 to 26 million Americans took to the streets, and time again, they were met with violence. In Buffalo, police assaulted 75-year-old Martin Gugino, shoving him to the ground and cracking his skull open. More than a dozen cops walked past Gugino as he lied on the ground, bleeding from a brain injury without doing anything to help him before medics arrived. In Los Angeles, a homeless man in a wheelchair was shot in the face with a less lethal round as he begged for mercy. In Minneapolis, photojournalist Linda Tirado was shot in the eye by a less lethal round while reporting on the protests, blinding her. Tirado was one of at least 148 journalists to be attacked or arrested by cops for daring to report on the protests. She is also one of at least 60 protesters to suffer a serious head injury after being shot by a less lethal round. It's worth explaining at this point what less lethal rounds actually are. There are a few different types that the police use, but the one Tirado was shot by was a sponge grenade, a round made out of plastic and foam that police fire using grenade launchers. They're designed to be shot at the ground and then bounce up and hit someone in the torso, because if you shoot someone in the head with one, you can very easily kill them. Naturally, during the George Floyd protests, Tirado and dozens of other protesters were shot in the head. See, that's why they're called less lethal instead of non-lethal, because they're still fucking guns. 3% of people shot by less lethal projectiles die, while 15% are left permanently injured. Another type of less lethal round you've probably heard of are beanbag rounds. Doesn't that sound fun? Beanbag rounds? Well, they're fabric sacks full of lead that are shot at people with shotguns. The term beanbag is a friendly way to describe shooting people with fucking buckshot. I'm not going to show any photos in this video, but if you wanted to see one that will burn its way into your brain, look up the photo of Leslie Furcron after she was shot in the forehead by a beanbag round. It's fucking disturbing. That shot to the face left her blind in one eye and with blistering headaches that forced her to drop out of college. But hey, she deserved to be shot in the face because she threw an empty can of Red Bull, that monster. That empty can could have seriously injured someone! The police also frequently use tear gas, which is illegal to use under the Geneva Conventions. And you might think, doesn't that make cops war criminals? Nope! There are specific exceptions in the Chemical Weapons Convention that allows tear gas to be used on civilians. So that's good, because otherwise every major American city would be filled with literal war criminals. One of the most disturbing things I saw happened in the Bronx. New York City enacted an 8 p.m. curfew during the protests, and, as an aside, the fact that cops can randomly decide it's illegal to protest after a certain time, then arrest anyone who protests police violence, is one of the most blatant First Amendment violations I have ever seen. Americans have the right to protest their government, unless the government doesn't like those protests. If the government dislikes the protests, then men with guns will show up to arrest you. I love living in a free country. Anyway, in the Bronx, a group of peaceful protesters were surrounded by an army of cops who refused to let them leave. The cops waited until 8 p.m., then charged in and began beating people with their batons for being out past curfew. It's a process called kettling, and I think every cop who takes part in it should be sent to prison for the rest of their goddamn lives. Hey, if you ever feel good about the intrinsic goodness of mankind and want that feeling to die, watch any video on police brutality and check the comments. It will make that faith die faster than a black child playing with a toy gun. These people broke the law, yes, but only because they were forced to by men with guns. They were physically prevented from going inside before the curfew went into effect. If they had tried to fight the police to escape, they would have been arrested and or shot. They had no choice but to break the law. It's like if a cop strapped a fucking bomb to your neck and forced you to rob a bank, then arrested you for robbing the bank. And then fucking Twitter reply guys would be like, well, if you didn't want to be arrested, you shouldn't have robbed the bank. Well, the cop was threatening to murder you if you didn't rob the bank. Also, even if these people broke the law, that does not give the police the right to assault them. We have the right to a fair trial. If you break the law, you're supposed to be taken to jail and given a trial by a jury of your peers, then sentenced to a punishment by a judge. Punishments for crimes aren't supposed to be handed out in the street by cops who've decided they're judge, jury, and torturer. Any beating by the police is A, unconstitutional, and B, a fucking crime. There are at least 950 recorded examples of police brutality during the 2020 protests, and likely far more that were not recorded. Do you know what I did this time 3 years ago? Night after night, I laid awake in bed till 5 a.m. watching every video showing police brutality I could. I don't recommend doing this, it was not good for my mental health. But it's what I did. There was this idea in my head that something important was happening and it was wrong to look away. That it would be wrong to not watch people being beaten and killed. Again, this was not a healthy thing to do. The brutality in 2020 permanently damaged the faith myself and millions of other Americans have in law enforcement. Many of these videos I watched have been seared into my brain. I'd like to show you one of these videos, a video in which thankfully no one is hurt because it is an excellent encapsulation of the biggest problem I have with American police.
No, there's more. Look at this. They just keep coming.
Go! Go inside! Get inside! Get inside! Get inside! Get in your house now! Let's go! Light him up! Go inside now! Get in the house!
Get in, get in, get in, get in, get in, get in! Get in!
Oh, God, that hurt. You good?
Are you okay?
Right on the fucking crotch.
Are you okay? You got hit?
I'm good. They're fucked for that, dude. What?
Okay.
For context, this video was filmed on May 31st, 2020 by a Minneapolis resident named Tanya Kurson. The first thing to note about this video is that it feels very dystopian. It shows an army of cops marching through the city, led by an armored military vehicle. These cops feel less like local law enforcement and more like an invading foreign army. And given the fact that 92% of Minneapolis cops at the time did not live in the city, they kinda were. The second thing to note is how petty this video is. A cop opens fire on people who have done nothing wrong for the crime of standing on their porch and filming the police. And yes, the police said to get inside, but also who gives a shit? Firing at these people does nothing to keep anyone safe. They are not a threat to these cops. They have done nothing wrong. All they have done is lightly subvert the authority of whiny toddlers with guns. These people have not broken the law. Under Minneapolis law at the time, you are allowed to stand on your property during curfews. Also, as M. Brandon Lee helpfully pointed out in that Twitter thread, the police changed the curfew ordinances to say you have to get inside when the cops tell you to, the same night they started firing on people for standing in their doorways. And it is not good for the police to change the law after the fact to make what people have already done illegal. Ex post facto criminalization is explicitly forbidden by Article 1 of the Constitution. And again, using curfews to criminalize protests is fucking unconstitutional! And God, I hate the fucking Twitter reply guy bootlickers in that thread. Actually, you should have just done what the cops said. Well, actually, the cops should have go fuck themselves. How about that? We should not have to do what the police say, even when the police are breaking the goddamn Constitution on threat of violence. Questioning of authority should not be met with ruthless aggression by men with guns. I don't want to live in that world, and it is disturbing how many people do. The most important thing we should ask about this and any video of a police interaction is, does this keep people safe? Does shooting someone with a paintball gun for filming cops keep anyone safe? Is this assault justified on the excuse that it is protecting public safety? And let's be clear, this is assault. People get arrested for shooting others with paintball guns all the time. Here's a case where people are arrested for assault with a deadly weapon for shooting people with paintballs in Sacramento County. Here's a case of assault and battery in Worcester. Here's a case of aggravated battery in Chicago. Here's a case of battery in Madison. And before you say Minnesota has different laws, here's a case of aggravated assault in St. Paul. It is not unreasonable for someone to be arrested for shooting someone with a paintball gun. And you know how I know the Minneapolis PD also thinks this is assault? Because if I were to go up to a bunch of cops and start firing at them with a paintball gun, they would have a problem with that. They would not laugh it off and say, ha ha ha, this is fine, and something that is completely legal to do. I would go to jail, assuming they didn't shoot me 30 times first. We as Americans are so exposed to police violence that we've grown numb. We don't instinctively think of shooting paintballs or beanbags or rubber bullets as assault, even when doing so can leave people with permanent injuries, because it happens so much it's normalized. We don't think of crimes committed by law enforcement as crimes because they happen so frequently. But we need to stop thinking like that. Like I said during the opening, I have no desire to demonize cops. I want to treat them like people. And if an ordinary person did this to you, shot at you for standing on your own property, you would be pissed. Why should we tolerate crime when it's committed by cops? So, a cop committed a relatively minor crime, and I think that's bad. But that isn't the reason I'm showing this video. I showed it because even more important than what this one cop does is what the other cops don't. This video shows a cop blatantly breaking the law, but the other cops don't give a shit. They don't arrest him. There are around, 20 cops there, and none of them arrest this guy. And that's weird, right? I mean, it isn't weird because it's commonplace, but it should be weird. We should expect, when cops break the law, that other cops arrest them. But this guy gleefully commits a felony over petty reasons in full view of 20 other cops because he knows for a fact that they will not do anything. And that, I think, is the biggest problem with the police. Generally speaking, cops don't arrest other cops. And we see this in all of these horrific incidents I've discussed today. In the vast, vast majority of the hundreds of examples of police brutality during the George Floyd protests, the cops involved were not arrested. In most cases, they weren't even fired. The cop who shot Leslie Fucron got promoted! During the kettling in the Bronx, dozens of cops watched their co-workers brutalize peaceful protesters. But they didn't arrest each other. They joined in. They saw violent felonies and decided, rather than enforcing the law and protecting the public, to help their buddies assault random people who had done nothing wrong. When those Buffalo cops assaulted Martin Gugino, more than a dozen cops sat back and watched it happen. They didn't arrest the 2 officers responsible until 2 days later, and the charges were eventually dropped. When these violent criminal cops were suspended, all 57 cops on the emergency response team resigned. They didn't just stand by and watch a felony, they were disgusted at the idea that a pair of violent felons weren't allowed to continue being cops. According to the union, these resignations were out of solidarity, although a few of the resigning cops disputed this, saying they quit because the union wouldn't pay for their legal fees when they committed crimes anymore. It's probably a mix of both reasons depending on the officer, but either way it's ridiculous. The Buffalo PD resigned from the emergency response team en masse, either because they were disappointed that there weren't criminals working with them anymore, or because they have to pay for their own legal fees when they commit violent crimes now. Also, I just love how tone-deaf the police union president's response was. He justified this by saying that they were just following orders. A lot of people probably think I was out of line for saying that American cops would carry out fascist violence if ordered to, but look! Police unions are already utilizing the fucking Nuremberg defense! The general response to these incidents is to claim that there are just a few bad apples. But look at how many bad apples there are! There were dozens of bad apples in the Bronx, and not a single good apple in sight. Do you know how astounding that is, statistically? Like, if 1 in 20 cops was bad, a random group of 50 cops all being bad is so unlikely, it's absurd. If the odds are 1 in 5, it's absurd. If 3 out of 4 cops are bastards, 50 different cops all being bad is still something so rare it's outstanding. The only way for any of these incidents to possibly happen is if being a bastard is nearly universal among members of law enforcement. I've spoken to conservatives about police brutality, and the consensus they've given me is, why should we care about police brutality anymore? Derek Chauvin went to jail. But the problem was never just one bad cop. It was the fact that police departments are filled to the fucking brim with violent felons. The cops responded to protests with horrific violence, that 100 reporters were beaten, and the cops who beat them are still employed by police departments. That people were blinded, that skulls were cracked, that there are armies of criminals with guns in our police departments, and no one in power gives a shit. It took 20 million people taking to the streets and riots that burned down a police department for Derek Chauvin to go to jail for murdering a man on camera as he begged for his life. And the cunts who killed Breonna Taylor are still free. So cops who assault journalists or fire on people for standing on their porch aren't going to go to jail, because the threshold for cops facing consequences is somewhere above accidentally gunning down an innocent woman after you broke into her home, and somewhere slightly below public lynchings. That's where the line for cops going to jail is. And it needs to be stated, crimes of this nature weren't just committed during a few weeks in 2020. They were more common then, but cops break the law constantly. People are assaulted by cops on a regular basis across this nation. It's hard to give exact statistics, though, because police misconduct records aren't publicly available in 31 states plus DC, and there is no nationwide database for police misconduct. Police departments and unions fight hard to keep these records out of the public eye. But USA Today, which has been a surprisingly useful source for this video, managed to acquire records on 200,000 different incidents from 44 different states, detailing crimes committed by 85,000 different officers over a period of 10 years. This included 22,924 investigations of excessive force, 3,145 allegations of rape, child molestation, and other sexual misconduct, 2,307 cases of domestic violence, and at least 2,227 cases of perjury, tampering with evidence or witnesses, or falsifying reports. And that is only a fraction of the number of crimes committed by police in this country. This is just the cases that A, USA Today could find records for, and B, there was an actual investigation. But remember, a lot of incidents don't get recorded by the police. A few dozen Bronx cops committed felonies on one night in 2020, and I'm willing to bet those crimes weren't written down and properly investigated. The actual number of police crimes is likely far, far higher than 20,000 a year. It's also worth noting that there are a lot of repeat offenders on that list. Almost 2,500 cops were investigated 10 different times. 20 different cops were investigated 100 or more times without being fired. That list admittedly does contain a lot of cops who were decertified for committing crimes, but most of them were not decertified, and I'm willing to bet that very, very few of them were, arrested. One of the most common forms of police crime is theft, which is essentially legal for cops to do through a wonderful process called civil asset forfeiture. Basically, cops are allowed to steal any property they believe was earned through illegal means. The thing is, cops don't have to prove that the money was earned illegally, or even charge people with a crime to take it. And you have to take the police to court and prove a negative to get your money back. This system is heavily abused by police departments, who go around robbing people at gunpoint to pad out their budgets. Also, Black and Hispanic people are far more likely to be robbed by the police for some reason that I can't place my finger on. Last year, I saw an absurd news story. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department robbed an armored car. They pulled over an armored car transporting money from cannabis sales, something that is completely legal in California, and, just robbed the truck. The deputies stole $1 million. And this isn't an isolated incident. A department in Kansas did the same thing. Like there's that scene in The Heat, where Robert De Niro is talking to Al Pacino, and he's like, "Hey, we aren't so different, you and I." And he's right, because Pacino is a cop in California, and apparently California cops also rob armored cars. From 2000 to 2019, $69 billion were stolen by cops through civil asset forfeiture. There are some years where more money was stolen by cops than by burglars. And considering the fact that cops only solve 13% of burglary cases, an argument can be made that because cops commit so much fucking crime, the existence of the police causes more crimes to be committed. I can't prove that, because to do so would require us to get rid of cops, and oh boy, that is not happening in any of our lifetimes. But it needs to be stated that at the very least, a substantial chunk of crime is committed by the police, by cops who do not go to jail because it is essentially legal for cops to commit crimes. There's a statistic that gets shared around a lot online that I'm a bit hesitant to put too much weight behind, that claims that 40% of cops beat their wives. This number comes from a 1991 study that interviewed 728 cops and 479 spouses and came to the conclusion that approximately 40% of cops abuse their spouses compared to 10% of the normal population. And that number is horrible, but the study was self-reported and didn't specify what counts as violence. Plus, it's a 30-year-old study, so I don't know how reliable that information is. Another study from a year later came to the conclusion that 25 to 28% of officers are violent towards their spouses, but again, that was 30 years ago. There needs to be more studies if we want an exact number, and I have a feeling the response from police departments to someone trying to investigate domestic abuse would be less than friendly. But regardless of the exact number, I don't doubt that domestic abuse is more common among law enforcement. A, because I've watched a ton of footage of police beating random people, and B, because cops often protect other cops. According to a 2013 study, 30% of cops accused of domestic abuse are still working for the same agency a year later. And it should be noted that a lot of the ones that leave because they get other jobs or retire, not because they are fired or, God forbid, arrested. Another study from 2003 found that in an analysis of 324 investigations of police domestic violence, 52% of the time, the officer was not fired. And those were all cases where an investigation happened at all. It is likely that there are thousands of domestic abuse cases out there that have not been investigated because the perpetrator was a cop. And setting aside all of the statistics, it makes sense that the rate of domestic abuse would be higher among law enforcement. Think about the type of person who abuses their spouse. Often those people are angry, power-hungry, and respond to questions of their authority with violence. If you are that type of person, someone who wants power and freedom to hurt others, what type of job would you seek out? Part of the reason so many cops are violent criminals is because police departments attract that type of person like a beacon. It's like the Catholic Church. The reason so many Catholic priests are child molesters is not because being a priest makes you want to rape children, but because the job gives you unfettered access to children, and because for years the unofficial policy of the church was to protect child rapists. So many cops are violent bastards because being a cop allows you to get away with being a violent bastard. The reason so many cops are able to commit crimes and not go to jail is thanks to a little thing the cops call the blue wall of silence. Cops are trained to treat each other as family and never arrest each other. To quote former cop Joseph Ested, when you first join the police academy, the first thing they'll tell you is, "This is your family now. We take care of each other. We look out for each other. We don't arrest each other. We'll always extend that benefit to take care of each other." Cops don't arrest cops because they are trained to look the other way when their fellow officers commit crimes. They're trained to see the world in terms of us and them. And, on one hand, being a cop is a stressful job, and you will inherently begin to trust and care for the people tasked with watching your back. But on the other hand, what the fuck am I even talking about? That guy sitting next to you in a cop car isn't your fucking brother, he's your co-worker, and he just committed a fucking felony. I'd turn in my co-workers in a heartbeat if I watched them commit a violent crime. Can you imagine if any other profession acted like this? Like, if a doctor beat the shit out of a patient for shits and giggles, then all the other doctors and nurses refuse to say anything because, well, being a doctor is a stressful job and we have to look out for each other. It's fucking ridiculous. And the irony of the blue wall of silence, this idea that cops look out for each other, is that it can be taken away in an instant if a cop decides to do the right thing. Occasionally, there are cops that decide to break the wall and testify against their coworkers. And time again, every other cop in 100 miles decides to make their life a living hell. Officers who have gone against other cops have been subject to harassment campaigns, firings, death threats, stalking, having dead rats shoved in their lockers, had requests for backup ignored, and even been framed for drug possession. Take Moses Black of Gonzales, Louisiana. In 2015, he witnessed his sergeant assault a handcuffed man. He reported it and was subsequently fired. Take Isaac Lambert of Chicago. In 2017, he watched as another cop shot an unarmed teenager. His superiors demanded he lie about the incident in a police report. When Lambert refused, he was demoted from detective. Take Scott McKee of Springfield, Oregon. He began investigating fellow officers for excessive force and for framing a man, so his fellow officers replaced a photo of his family with a photoshopped meme of him being decapitated, captioned, "Headhunting. It's not just for natives." McKee was then fired. Take Adrian Schoolcraft of New York. He secretly recorded other cops, exposing that the NYPD was A, wrongfully arresting innocent people, and B, underreporting crimes. Both as part of a scheme to artificially deflate crime statistics. So his fellow officers broke into his home, kidnapped him, assaulted him, and locked him away in an asylum. Last, I would like to discuss the case of Javier Esqueda of Joliet, Illinois. In 2020, a man named Eric Lurie was arrested after consuming a lethal amount of an unidentified white powder. Rather than call an ambulance for the man they knew were dying, as police guidelines demand, the two cops ignored him for 11 minutes. When they finally decided to do something, one of the officers decided to slap and choke him to make him spit up the drugs, despite that violating an Illinois ban on chokeholds. Lurie was eventually taken to a hospital where he died. Neither cop bothered to record that Lurie had died in their police reports. The officers also turned off their microphones at one point while Lurie was dying, which implies they intended to cover up the incident. Neither officer faced any consequences for Lurie's death. This incident disgusted Esqueda, so he decided to release the footage to a local news station. He was then arrested and now is facing 20 years in prison for refusing to sweep a death in custody under the rug, for deciding the public had a right to know what the police did to Eric Lurie. So it's easy to see why cops don't give a shit about the law. If standing up to other cops can lead to 20 years, the average cop sure as hell isn't going to make that sacrifice just because they saw some protester get beaten with a baton or shot in the head with a rubber bullet. Despite the posturing and propaganda, a lot of cops are cowards. And the most dangerous thing for them is other cops. And that's the thing about the blue wall. Cops don't give a fuck about other cops. They'll ruin another cop's life in a heartbeat. What cops care about is power. And whistleblowers threaten that power. Protesters threaten that power. A woman standing on her porch filming them threatens that power. They become cops because they like power and they hurt anyone who threatens it. It should be noted, though, that Javier Esqueda is also a bastard. He watched as one of his subordinates tackled and injured a woman at a prayer vigil in 2019 and did nothing. Esqueda isn't some saint risking everything because he thinks police should be bound by the same laws as everyone else. He's fine with assault, he just draws the line at manslaughter. This is what people mean when they say all cops are bastards. Not because every single cop is a violent criminal, although a big chunk of them are. All cops are bastards because time and time again, police departments protect violent criminals. They fire cops who try to stand up to the bastards. They sit back as innocent people are victimized by gangsters with guns and do nothing because camaraderie among cops is more important than the lives of their victims. And some people have argued that we should stop saying ACAB, that it's a provocative phrase that turns people off, and I disagree. Because conservatives froth at the mouth with rage when people say Black Lives Matter. Like, there is no phrase for a movement that seeks to end police violence that will not be repeated with contempt by the right. When the President of the United States is complaining about anti-fascists, saying, those guys who hate fascism are the real bad guys, it is clear that no slogan will be passive enough. The right doesn't hate us because we say ACAB. They hate us because we say cops shouldn't be allowed to commit violent crimes. Now, as I come towards the close of this video, I will finally address what I am certain a bunch of people who watch 5 minutes before getting mad and going to the comments section have been complaining about. What about the riots? And to that I say, what about the riots? What does that have to do with anything I've been talking about? Like, sure, there were riots. 93% of protests were completely peaceful, but yes, there were riots. There was property damage and theft and violence by protesters. But I think that's less a knock against protesters as a whole, and more just an inevitable circumstance of gathering 20 million people. Inevitably, some of them will commit crimes regardless of what they're marching for. But that doesn't really justify cops committing other crimes in response. Like, how does someone setting fire to a Target in Minneapolis justify cracking a man's skull open in Buffalo? Bringing up the riots is a non sequitur. The fact that some protesters committed crimes somewhere does not make it legal nor moral for cops to commit crimes against other protesters. Like, imagine if that was how our justice system worked. Like, yes, Your Honor, I did stab a man in Chicago, but that's fine, because someone he never met robbed a convenience store in Miami, and that makes what I did legal somehow. What's that? I'm going to jail for murder? But other people committed unrelated crimes in other parts of the country! Even if the protests were as violent as conservative pundits claimed, and to be clear, they sure as fuck were not, that does not justify a single crime committed by law enforcement. And it certainly does not retroactively justify crimes committed before the riots even began. But, while the riots do not justify police actions morally, they do to an extent explain their motives. American law enforcement did not go on a violent crime spree because they're a bunch of violent thugs who get off on hurting people. They went on a violent crime spree because they're a bunch of violent thugs who get off on hurting people, and also to reassert their authority. After the lynching of George Floyd, people questioned the police. They questioned if cops were good for society, if systemic change was even possible. And the police responded to this by making it clear that they cannot be questioned, that their authority is insurmountable because it is derived from the barrel of a gun. They shot paintballs at people standing on porches. They shot rubber bullets at old men in wheelchairs. They blinded journalists to make sure everybody knew who was in charge, to make sure the entire country knew that threats to their power would be met with violence. If the goal was to stop riots, the cops failed horribly. Responding to peaceful protests with tremendous violence just made those people hate the police 10 times more. It confirmed everything they thought about law enforcement. Police showed up to peaceful protests and started firing, and that is what turned the protests to riots. But the goal was not to stop riots. It was to make people afraid. It was to silence dissent. And the thing about the riots is, they worked. I do not think Derek Chauvin would be in jail right now if the good people of Minneapolis didn't burn down a police station. The streets of Minneapolis are safer now because of the riots. The riots were not just random destruction. They were random destruction to accomplish a very important goal. And you know what? Let's stop pretending that protesters were the only ones who rioted. People rioted in 2020, sure, but so did the cops. That kettling in the Bronx? That was a riot. And I think they're rioting because you don't want your children to be killed by racist cops is a hell of a lot more justifiable than rioting because you want the right to hunt black people for sport. Also, rioters were arrested. More than 17,000 people were arrested. And considering the fact that only a few hundred of them were arrested for arson or theft, and the fact that a vast majority of them were arrested for things like curfew violations, it is safe to say that the police didn't just arrest the rioters, they arrested more people for rioting than actually rioted. To end this video, I'd like to talk about one more criminal cop, Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin is a bastard, but he didn't become a bastard the day he murdered George Floyd. Chauvin had a long criminal history before the lynching. 18 different complaints were filed against Chauvin over the years, and he was not fired or arrested. In 2006, Wayne Reyes, a Native American man suspected of stabbing his girlfriend, was shot 23 times by Chauvin and 5 other officers. To be fair, the officers claimed Reyes pointed a gun at them, which would make the shooting justified. On the other hand, I do not trust anything cops say, especially not after they've killed someone. The police report filed after the lynching of George Floyd did not contain any mention of the lynching. It just said, well, we arrested him and then he suddenly died, neglecting to mention the fact that he died after Chauvin strangled him while he begged for his life. Derek Chauvin and his buddies lied on a police report to cover up the murder of George Floyd, so I do not trust the police report filed after the death of Reyes. Maybe he had a gun, maybe he didn't. I don't know. In 2008, Derek Chauvin responded to a domestic incident and beat unarmed African-American man Ira Latrell Torres with his gun. When Torres raised his hands to defend himself, Chauvin shot him twice at point-blank range. Convicted murderer with a history of lying on police reports, Derek Chauvin claims Torres reached for his gun. Torres, who survived, disputes this. In 2011, Alaska native Leroy Martinez was shot by one of Chauvin's fellow officers while Chauvin watched. According to an eyewitness, this was after Martinez dropped his gun and put his hands in the air. In 2017, Chauvin responded to a domestic disturbance involving a 14-year-old black teenager. Chauvin beat the teenager with a flashlight, hitting him so hard that he needed stitches before putting his knee on the child's neck and choking him until he fell unconscious. You'll notice this is the same thing that killed Eric Garner in 2014 and the thing that killed George Floyd 3 years later. Derek Chauvin attempted to murder a child. He tried to kill a kid and was not arrested. He had 18 complaints against him and wasn't even fired. He was put in charge of training other cops! George Floyd is dead because of Derek Chauvin, but Chauvin isn't the only one with a guilty conscience. Time and time again, the Minneapolis PD ignored his crimes. They decided it was legal for Derek Chauvin to commit violent felonies, and thus the felonies continued until 20 million people took to the streets and demanded they cease. Also, it sure is weird that all the people Chauvin killed or attempted to kill were black or indigenous. I bet that's just a wacky coincidence and not a sign that Derek Chauvin is a racist piece of shit whose first instinct when seeing a person of color is to escalate things to violence. Remember all those cops with 100 different internal affairs investigations? One of them is going to kill someone one of these days. There will be more George Floyds, because police departments refuse to arrest the violent monsters who infest their ranks like a cancer. People will continue to riot every time the police carry out a lynching, because that's the only way this ends. The police have the power to end the riots anytime they'd like. If you're mad about riots, be mad at the police. Be mad they made the riots necessary. Be furious they didn't fix this problem decades ago. Be mad that there were 3 other cops present at the lynching of George Floyd and none of them did anything to stop that murder. Derek Chauvin decided to murder George Floyd, and instead of stopping him, the other cops helped him with the lynching. J. Alexander Kang and Thomas Lane helped hold Floyd down, while Tao Thao, another cop with a lengthy history of violence, mocked Floyd and shoved away a bystander who tried to intervene. Those 3 cops helped Chauvin carry out a murder instead of, shooting him in the head. Like, I'm being flippant, but seriously, they had a moral obligation to shoot Chauvin, which they ignored. If they had shot Derek Chauvin, George Floyd would still be alive. At the start of this video, I said it was moral for cops to kill armed criminals to protect innocent people, and I stand by that. And Derek Chauvin was a criminal, with a gun, carrying out a murder in front of 3 cops. The idea of them shooting him is absurd, but why? If the police were ever justified in shooting anyone, it would be Derek Chauvin. But 99.99999% of cops would never do that, because They're family. They take care of one another. They look out for each other. They don't arrest each other. If one of them decides to lynch a man, then it's the job of all of them to ensure that lynching goes off without a hitch. You know, there's this idea in the US, the good guy with the gun. This idea conservatives have that the best way to stop crime is for everyone to be armed so they can shoot criminals. But that idea falls apart when cops commit crimes. Because do you know what would have happened if someone tried to kill Chauvin? Hell, if someone had tried to merely punch him to save George Floyd's life, Tao Thao would have shot that good guy with the gun in a heartbeat. If a cop decides to commit a crime, and again, cops commit more crimes per capita than non-cops do, it becomes the job of every cop around to ensure that crime goes off without a hitch. That no one interferes. That no one dares to defend themselves from the violence of the state. Because cops protect cops. And I would like to ask, one more time, does this keep us safe? Does the existence of law enforcement keep us safe? Well, that depends on the person. Sure, some people have been saved by the police over the years, but not everyone. Not George Floyd, not the dozens assaulted in the Bronx, not Linda Tirado or the 100 journalists who were beaten, not Leslie Fucron or Martin Gugino, not Eric Lurie, not Breonna Taylor, not Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Daniel Shaver, Freddie Gray, Tyre Nichols, Oscar Grant, Philando Castile, or any of the countless other people murdered by the police. They were not protected from crime and violence because police departments decided that solidarity with murderers was more important than the lives of the people they swore to protect.